Imagine walking into a grand hall where banners speak of unity, sovereignty, and African pride. Cameras flash, diplomats adjust their suits, and the African Union prepares for another ceremonial meeting. For most, this is politics as usual. Speeches will be read, statements will be drafted, and by the end of the day, very little will change. But on this day, something different was about to happen. Into this carefully choreographed theater walked a man who refused to play the role assigned to him. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, carried neither the polished language of career diplomats nor the cautious patience of older leaders. Instead, he carried questions. Simple, piercing questions that would silence an entire room. You will hear about the African Union. Yes, it exists. But what is its effect in reality? Delegates shifted in their seats. For decades, the AU had presented itself as the guardian of African integration, the voice of sovereignty. Yet wars raged across the continent. Millions of young lives were lost, and foreign military bases operated freely on African soil. Traoré's voice cut through the formalities. If the AU was truly a union, why could it not defend its own people? What made his presence so striking was not just his age, barely in his 30s, but his authenticity. He was not raised in the luxury of diplomatic circles. He came from a landlocked nation, where people still walk miles for water, where gold mines too often enriched outsiders, and where survival required resilience. To many in that hall, he looked less like a polished politician and more like the very people they claimed to represent. For ordinary Africans watching at home, the moment was electrifying. Here was a leader refusing to pretend. Here was someone willing to ask what millions were already thinking. Why does sovereignty look so ceremonial, while dependence feels so real? The words carried the weight of frustration shared across generations. This was not a speech written to impress. It was a challenge, a demand for accountability. And as the cameras rolled, the African Union, an institution that had long operated behind the shield of protocol, suddenly found itself exposed. But the real drama was only beginning, because Traoré was not there to criticize alone. He had something far more devastating, proof that his small, resource-strained country had already achieved what the AU said was impossible. The question was clear. If Burkina Faso could do it, what excuse did the rest of Africa have? The main event began not with applause, but with silence. Silence that came after a series of questions so basic, so obvious, that no one inside the African Union Hall could answer them without exposing decades of failure. Why are we still debating sovereignty while foreign military bases operate freely across our continent? Traoré asked. How can we claim to represent African interests while our resources continue flowing out at prices we don't set? Why do we need external permission to manage our own security challenges? Around the hall, ministers exchanged nervous glances. These were not abstract debates about frameworks or protocols. These were the lived realities of millions of Africans. And they were being voiced not by critics outside the system, but by a head of state who had already begun to change those realities in his own country. Instead of relying on theory, Traoré brought evidence. He did not speak in slogans. He spoke in results. In Burkina Faso, a country often dismissed as too small, too poor, too unstable, major changes had already begun. His government had reclaimed control of key gold mines, ensuring that revenues once siphoned off by foreign companies now flowed into the national treasury. For the first time in decades, that money was being used to fund domestic priorities, irrigation canals, local schools, and solar-powered pumping stations that kept farmland alive even when rains failed. He pointed to rising agricultural output. Sorghum and maize production had increased enough to not only feed more families at home, but even open the door to export deals abroad. In fact, Burkina Faso had just signed a multi-billion-dollar agreement with India to supply grain, an unimaginable achievement for a nation that once struggled to feed itself. Then came the subject of security. For years, foreign military bases were justified as necessary to stabilize the Sahel. Yet violence persisted. Burkina Faso chose a different path: expel those bases, strengthen local command, and train community-based defense units. The results were not perfect, but attacks had decreased in key regions. Villages once abandoned out of fear were beginning to see people return. Each example stood as a direct contradiction to the AU's comfortable excuses. For years, officials claimed Africa could not manage its own resources without external oversight. Burkina Faso was doing it. They argued that regional stability required international troops. Burkina Faso proved otherwise. They warned that rejecting foreign loans and aid would collapse the economy. Yet Burkina Faso was redirecting gold revenues to fund projects without IMF debt strings attached. What made the demonstration even more powerful was its modesty. Traoré did not claim Burkina Faso had solved all its problems. He admitted challenges remained. But the progress was undeniable, and that was the point. If one of Africa's poorest, landlocked nations could make tangible gains, why were larger, richer countries still stuck in the same patterns? At one point, he held up a simple comparison. While AU summits speak of economic integration, he said, most of our countries still trade more with former colonizers than with each other. While we speak of sovereignty, our currencies remain pegged to powers outside Africa. While we speak of industrialization, our economies remain extractive. Burkina Faso has begun breaking these chains. Why can't we all? Because the truth was not that Africa's problems were too complex. The truth was that the AU had grown comfortable with the status quo, comfortable with external partnerships that kept aid flowing, comfortable with ceremonial speeches that preserved their positions, comfortable with explaining why independence had to remain just out of reach. And here was Traoré, a man with fewer resources, fewer allies, and greater external pressure, doing what they claimed was impossible. For ordinary Africans watching the broadcast, the moment was transformative. It was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about the possibility that decades of excuses could finally be broken. It was about seeing someone stand up and prove that independence was not a dream to be endlessly delayed, but a reality to be seized. The AU's leadership had prepared for another scripted summit. Instead, they found themselves facing a mirror that reflected not Africa's potential, but their own complacency. But if the evidence was already so damning, what happened when Traoré pushed past facts and struck at the very pride of Africa's leaders? That was when the confrontation reached its climax. The climax came not when Traoré laid out statistics or described reforms, but when he shifted from facts to fundamentals. He asked the kind of questions that stripped away all ceremony and left only raw truth. Why, he asked, are we still begging for permission to solve our own problems? Why do we allow foreign troops to stay while our young people die in wars that should have ended long ago? Why do we trade our resources abroad and import poverty back home? The room grew tense. For many leaders in attendance, these questions were not new. They were the very questions their citizens asked them at rallies, in marketplaces, in late-night radio call-ins. But to hear them spoken openly, in front of cameras, with no diplomatic sugarcoating, was a humiliation. It was as if the AU itself had been unmasked. Then Traoré went further. He turned the AU's proudest symbol, its claim to represent African sovereignty, into an indictment. You call yourselves a union, he said, looking across the hall. But what is your union worth if you cannot defend even one of us? What is integration worth if our youth are still forced to flee their homes, if our economies are still dictated from abroad, if our future is still mortgaged to creditors in Paris, Washington, or Beijing? The words hit hard because they were not abstractions. They connected directly to human suffering. Viewers across Africa thought of their own families, farmers watching harvests fail while imported food prices soared, miners digging wealth from the soil only to see profits leave the country, mothers bearing sons lost to endless conflicts. Traoré's delivery was calm, almost measured, but that made it more devastating. He was not shouting. He was not grandstanding. He was simply holding up a mirror and refusing to look away. And then came the most searing line of the day. Africa does not need more declarations, he said. Africa needs results. If Burkina Faso, with all its limitations, can reclaim its sovereignty, then what excuse do the rest of you have? What excuse will you give to the millions of young Africans who are told to wait another decade, another generation, for a future that should already be theirs? The hall fell into silence. Not the respectful silence of applause waiting to erupt, but the uneasy quiet of people who have no defense. Reactions varied. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on their notes. Others stared at Traoré with visible frustration, anger simmering behind polite faces. A handful, however, nodded slightly, as if relieved someone had finally said what they themselves were too cautious to admit. Outside the hall, the impact was immediate. On social media across Africa, clips of his speech spread like wildfire. Young activists in Dakar, Lagos, Johannesburg, and Bamako began quoting his lines. Hashtags calling for real independence and no more excuses trended within hours. To the youth, Traoré's words were not reckless. They were liberation. Meanwhile, international observers were stunned. For years, external powers had relied on the AU as a reliable partner, a gatekeeper that managed Africa's engagement with the world. Seeing the AU publicly challenged by one of its own leaders was unsettling. It suggested that the old arrangements, where the AU absorbed frustrations while external actors kept their influence, might not last much longer. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was even more emotional. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in front of television shops, applauding when his words were replayed on evening news. Families saw in him not just a politician, but a son of Africa standing tall. For those who had lost loved ones to hunger or conflict, the speech carried a simple message. Their suffering was not invisible. But the AU's leadership was shaken. Their usual rhythm of summits, carefully choreographed, insulated from real accountability, had been broken. They scrambled to issue statements afterward, speaking of unity and ongoing reform. Yet those words now sounded hollow. Every declaration they had crafted about sovereignty seemed like empty ceremony when compared with Traoré's straightforward demand for results. The real drama was not in the words themselves, but in the silence that followed. Because silence, in this case, was confession. It was the acknowledgement that a small, resource-strained nation had accomplished more for sovereignty than the entire continental institution designed to protect it. But speeches alone do not feed families or secure borders. The real question now was this. What would Traoré's confrontation mean for the daily lives of Africans, in their markets, their schools, their fields? That is where the true impact would be felt. The aftermath of Traoré's confrontation with the African Union was not confined to the walls of the summit hall. Its echoes rippled into villages, markets, and parliaments across the continent. For ordinary Africans, the speech was not about diplomatic theater. It was about survival, dignity, and the chance to believe again that their lives could change. In Burkina Faso, the civil impact was immediate. Farmers in the arid north, long accustomed to watching their children walk miles for water, suddenly felt that their struggles were being voiced at the highest levels. Traoré's government had already begun constructing a massive irrigation canal, powered by solar pumping stations, to secure food production even in the face of drought. For these families, hearing their leader challenge the AU was not abstract politics. It was reassurance that the sacrifices they made were part of a larger fight for sovereignty. Market traders in Ouagadougou spoke of the pride they felt seeing their president refuse to bow to external powers. For once, one shopkeeper told a local reporter, someone spoke the truth to their faces. He said what we all know, that we are tired of waiting for others to save us. Across the Sahel, young people in Mali and Niger saw the speech as validation of their own struggles. Both countries had already joined Burkina Faso in rejecting certain foreign military partnerships. Traoré's blunt words gave momentum to a growing sense that West Africa could forge its own path. Civil society groups began holding forums to discuss resource independence, regional trade, and security cooperation without outside interference. But the political impact was even more profound. Inside the AU itself, divisions widened. Some older leaders defended the organization, insisting that gradual reform was the only realistic path. Yet others, particularly younger ministers and reform-minded officials, quietly admitted that Traoré had forced an overdue reckoning. They recognized that if the AU did not evolve, it risked losing legitimacy altogether. In capitals far from Ouagadougou, ripple effects appeared. In Nigeria, activists questioned why one of Africa's largest oil producers still imported refined fuel while profits flowed to foreign companies. In South Africa, mining communities demanded greater local ownership of mineral wealth. In Congo, student groups held rallies asking why their vast cobalt resources had not lifted living standards. Each of these movements pointed to Burkina Faso as proof that alternatives existed. Even within Burkina Faso, the expectations of citizens grew. Traoré's defiance at the AU created hope, but also pressure. Families wanted to see continued delivery, more schools built, more clinics stocked with medicine, more opportunities for the young to work at home rather than risk dangerous migration routes. Hope, after all, is powerful, but it can quickly turn to disappointment if not matched by results. For women like Awa, a widow in the northern province of Yatenga, the political debates boiled down to something deeply personal. She had lost her husband to violence years earlier and struggled to feed her 3 children. When asked what she thought of Traoré's speech, she replied simply, "If his courage means my children can go to school without hunger, then may God protect him." Her words captured the essence of the civil impact. People were not measuring independence in grand statements, but in daily bread. Politically, the AU was forced into a corner. To acknowledge Traoré's achievements would be to admit decades of organizational failure. To dismiss them outright risked alienating the very populations they claimed to represent. The AU issued guarded communiques about ongoing challenges and the need for unity, but these only reinforced the perception of detachment. Meanwhile, governments aligned closely with external powers faced a dilemma. Should they double down on old arrangements or cautiously explore the path Burkina Faso was carving? For some, the fear of sanctions or aid cuts loomed large, but others began discreet conversations about reducing dependence and increasing regional cooperation. The broader civil impact was a shift in confidence. For too long, many Africans had internalized the belief that independence was symbolic rather than practical, that poverty and dependence were inevitable. Traoré's actions cracked that narrative. Suddenly, people could point to tangible changes: gold revenues staying at home, fields irrigated without foreign loans, communities regaining control of security. Yet while African citizens celebrated and debated, the wider world was watching with unease. What would it mean for the United States, Europe, and global powers if the AU's authority weakened and nations like Burkina Faso took a more independent road? That question would shape the international response. If the African Union felt shaken, foreign capitals felt something closer to alarm. For decades, Washington, Paris, and Brussels had relied on the AU as a stabilizing partner, an institution that could absorb frustrations and ensure that Africa's engagement with the world remained predictable. Traoré's open challenge disrupted that comfort. In the United States, policymakers debated what Burkina Faso's example meant for American interests. On one hand, U.S. officials argued that the AU was still essential for coordinating counterterrorism and peacekeeping efforts. On the other hand, intelligence briefings warned that younger African leaders might no longer accept arrangements that tied sovereignty to external military presence. The prospect of African nations insisting on independent security frameworks raised difficult questions. Would American bases be asked to leave? Would trade agreements tied to aid be renegotiated on less favorable terms? Europe faced similar anxieties. France, once deeply entrenched in West Africa, had already seen its influence wane after withdrawals from Mali and Burkina Faso. Traoré's words at the AU only accelerated that perception. The age of French dominance in the Sahel was over. European Union officials spoke cautiously about partnerships based on equality, but privately worried that resource contracts, from gold to uranium, might be rewritten. India and China, meanwhile, saw opportunity. For them, Burkina Faso's defiance represented not just risk, but possibility. India had already secured a multi-billion-dollar grain deal, while China looked at infrastructure partnerships that could bypass traditional Western frameworks. In Beijing and New Delhi, Traoré was seen less as a disruptor and more as a negotiator of a new order. The global lens was clear. Burkina Faso had become a test case. If one small nation could reject external dependency and still find partners, others might follow. And if they did, the geopolitical map of Africa would be redrawn. But what comes next? For Africa, for the AU, and for Burkina Faso itself, the confrontation was only the beginning. The deeper question is whether this spark will ignite true continental change, or whether old forces will find ways to contain it. The confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and the African Union was more than a speech. It was a turning point, a mirror held up to a continent caught between symbolic sovereignty and real independence. In that hall, the AU was forced to face a truth it had long avoided, that excuses no longer satisfy a generation that demands results. For millions of ordinary Africans, the moment was not about diplomatic drama. It was about hope. Hope that their leaders might finally prioritize African lives over external approval. Hope that the resources beneath their soil and the strength of their youth could fuel prosperity rather than dependency. Hope that sovereignty could mean more than a flag and an anthem. Yet hope brings risk. The more expectations rise, the more dangerous disappointment becomes. If Burkina Faso falters, skeptics will say independence is impossible. If the AU fails to adapt, frustration could turn to rejection, leaving the institution irrelevant. The next 3 to 6 months will be critical. Will the AU take steps to reform, to prove it can deliver more than ceremonies? Or will young Africans look elsewhere, to new alliances, new movements, new leaders, to shape their future? One possible scenario: Smaller states in the Sahel form deeper regional unions, bypassing the AU entirely. Their cooperation on resources and security could create a model that others, from Central to Southern Africa, begin to copy. Another scenario: external powers, sensing opportunity, compete fiercely for new partnerships, reshaping Africa's alliances faster than ever before. For the United States and Europe, the message is clear: the age of comfortable arrangements is ending. For Africa's youth, the message is even clearer: the time of waiting is over. As viewers, we are left with a question that goes beyond Burkina Faso, beyond the AU, beyond even Africa. It is a question for all of us. When people who have been told for generations that change is impossible suddenly prove it is possible, what happens next? Think of the farmers who only want to feed their families, the young workers who dream of dignity at home rather than risking their lives abroad. Their future depends on whether leaders choose comfort or courage. And maybe, just maybe, the courage of one small nation can inspire an entire continent.